In the dark, they glowed. The young women who painted watch dials in Orange, New Jersey, walked home at night trailing a faint light. It clung to their hair, dusted their eyelashes, settled into the creases of their dresses. Their co-workers called them the Ghost Girls. The boys they danced with at the Saturday socials could pick them out across a crowded hall by the shimmer on their skin. Some of the women thought it was beautiful. They painted their fingernails with the stuff. They painted their teeth before a date, so their smiles would glow in the dark when the lights went down. They had no way of knowing they were painting themselves with their own deaths. The paint was called undark. Its secret ingredient was radium, the most wondrous, most expensive, most celebrated substance on Earth. And by the time anyone in a position of power admitted what it was doing to these women, dozens of them were already in the ground, and their employers had spent years lying to their faces, forging medical reports, and blaming their agony on syphilis to protect a profit. This is the story of the Radium Girls. It is a story about greed and about a poison that glows. But more than that, it is the story of a handful of dying women who could no longer lift their arms to swear an oath in court, and who changed American law forever. To understand how this happened, you have to understand how the world felt about radium 100 years ago. Because in 1917, radium was not a warning, it was a miracle. Marie and Pierre Curie had isolated the element in 1898, extracting a tiny, glowing speck from tons of a mineral called pitchblende. It was luminous. It was warm to the touch. It seemed to pour out energy from nothing, defying every law of physics anyone thought they understood. The public was enchanted. If this strange element could glow with its own inner life, people reasoned, surely it was brimming with vitality. Surely it could pour that vitality into the human body. And so, in the first decades of the 20th century, radium became the wonder cure of the age. You could buy radium water, sold as a health tonic to the wealthy. There was radium toothpaste, promising a brighter smile, radium face cream, radium chocolate, radium suppositories, even radium-infused wool for babies. Clinics sold radium treatments for arthritis, high blood pressure, and impotence. Radium was luxury. It was modernity. It was, gram for gram, one of the most expensive substances on the planet, worth more than its weight in gold many times over. Almost no one understood that radioactivity, the very property that made radium glow, was the property that made it lethal. Radium is relentlessly, permanently unstable. It throws off radiation every second, and it does not stop. Its half-life is about 1,600 years. A speck of it will still be dangerous long after everyone reading this, and everyone they will ever meet is dust. But in 1917, that danger was invisible to the public. What people saw was the glow. The glow had a use, and the use paid wages. During the First World War, soldiers needed to read their instruments in the dark. Watches, compasses, gauges, gun sights. A luminous paint that let a man check the time in a trench without striking a match was worth a fortune to the military. The paint was made by mixing radium powder with zinc sulfide and a binder. The radium's radiation made the zinc sulfide glow. They called the product Undark, and the company that made it, in Orange, New Jersey, was the United States Radium Corporation. The work of painting the dials fell to young women. It was considered delicate, skilled work, the kind of fine handwork that, at the time, was thought to suit female hands. The pay was good for the era, better than a factory line, better than a shop counter. A dial painter might earn 3 or 4 times what her friends made elsewhere. Whole circles of sisters, cousins, and neighborhood friends came to work there together. Many were teenagers. The youngest were 14. They sat at long tables, each woman with a tiny crucible of glowing paint and a fine camel hair brush. The dials were small, the numbers smaller, and the brush had to hold a perfect point to paint them. After a few strokes, the bristles would splay. So the supervisors taught the women a technique to keep the tip sharp. They called it lip pointing. Put the brush between your lips. Twirl it into a point with your tongue. Dip it in the paint. Paint the number. And then, when the point spread again, lip, dip, paint, lip, dip, paint. Hundreds of times a day, 250 dials a shift. Every time a woman put that brush to her lips, she swallowed a trace of radium. Some of them asked early on whether it was safe. They were told it was. They were told, in some cases, that the paint was good for them, that it would put roses in their cheeks. The most senior man at the company, Dr. Sabin von Sokocki, the chemist who had actually invented the luminous paint, is said to have once seen a painter lip-pointing her brush and told her to stop, warning it would make her sick. But that private caution never became company policy. The lip-pointing went on. It was faster, and speed was money. The women, trusting, went further than the job required. In a workplace filled with a substance that glowed, they played with it. They painted their nails and let them shine. They dabbed it on their teeth. One woman painted it over her whole face before a date and gave her sweetheart a fright in the dark. The radium dust drifted through the air of the studio and settled on everything so that the women themselves began to glow. Their clothes, their hair, the very outline of them faintly luminous when they walked home at dusk. They were, quite literally, absorbing their work into their bones. Here is the cruel chemistry at the heart of this story, and it is worth understanding because it explains everything that follows. Radium behaves in the human body almost exactly like calcium. To your bones, they look like the same thing. So when these women swallowed radium day after day, their bodies did not flush it out. Their bodies filed it away where they file calcium, into the skeleton, into the jaw, the spine, the long bones of the legs. The radium settled into the bone and stayed, and from inside the bone, it did what radium always does. It radiated. Every second from the inside, it fired microscopic bullets into the living tissue pressed against it. There was no escaping it because it was inside them. The very structure meant to hold them up was now a slow, permanent source of radiation, killing the bone from within and poisoning the marrow that made their blood. The first sign, for many, was in the mouth. A tooth would ache, then loosen. The dentist would pull it, and the socket would not heal. Instead, the wound festered and spread, the jawbone beneath it dying and crumbling. Doctors gave the condition a name, radium jaw. In the worst cases, a woman's jaw would decay so badly that pieces of it came away in her hands, or a physician could lift out sections of dead bone with his fingers. Then came the rest. Crippling anemia, as the poisoned marrow failed. Bones so brittle they snapped under the ordinary weight of a body. Women who broke a leg simply by standing, whose spines collapsed and left them shrinking, hunched in constant pain. Tumors bloomed in the bone. Some women developed sarcomas the size of grapefruits. They lost weight until they were skeletal. They lost the ability to walk. And through all of it, the doctors of the day, who had never seen anything like it, reached for the wrong answers. The most infamous wrong answer was syphilis. Her name was Mollie Maggia. Everyone called her Mollie. She had been one of the dial painters, one of a circle of sisters who all worked at the plant. In 1921, her health began to fail. It started, as it so often did, with a toothache. The tooth was pulled. The socket would not heal. Then another tooth, and another, and the ulcers spread across her gums until her mouth was a mass of infection. Her dentist, horrified, found that her jawbone had gone soft and dead. At one appointment, he reached into her mouth and, with barely any pressure, lifted her entire lower jaw out in pieces. The infection spread into her throat. In September 1922, at the age of 24, Mollie Maggia hemorrhaged and died. She had been in agony for over a year, and no one had been able to tell her why. On her death certificate, a doctor wrote the cause of death as syphilis. It was not true. Mollie Maggia had died of radium poisoning, of her own jaw and skull disintegrating from the radium lodged in her bones. But syphilis was a convenient lie. It was a disease that carried shame, a disease people whispered about. To blame these young women's deaths on a venereal infection was to blame the women themselves. To imply their suffering was the wage of loose living, not of the paint their employer had put in their mouths. It shifted the story from the factory to the bedroom. It protected the company. That lie would echo for years. And it points to something this story keeps returning to. The people running the United States Radium Corporation did not simply fail to protect their workers. As the evidence mounted, they worked to hide it. By the mid-1920s, the company could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. Its dial painters were dropping, dying, disfigured, or too sick to work, in numbers no ordinary bad luck could explain. Word was spreading. So the company's president, Arthur Roeder, did something that, on its face, looked responsible. He commissioned an independent investigation. He hired one of the most respected industrial hygiene experts in the country, Dr. Cecil Drinker of Harvard, a specialist in workplace disease. Drinker and his team came to the orange plant and studied it carefully. And what they found alarmed them. The studio was saturated with radioactive dust. On the tables, in the air, on the workers' skin and clothing and hair. The blood tests of the dial painters were abnormal. Drinker concluded, plainly, that the workers were being poisoned by their work, and that the lip-pointing technique was ingesting radium straight into their bodies. He wrote it all up in a report and delivered it to the company. And the company changed it. When the findings were passed along to the New Jersey Department of Labor, the version that arrived had been altered. Where Drinker had documented sick and abnormal women, the company's account claimed that every girl is in perfect condition. President Roeder is reported to have essentially forged a version of the findings, reversing Drinker's conclusions, and forwarded that sanitized account to the state as though it were the expert's own work. Cecil Drinker eventually learned that his research had been twisted into a lie and used to reassure the very regulators who might have shut the plant down. When the company caught wind that he intended to publish the truth, it threatened him with legal action. Drinker and his wife and research partner Catherine published anyway. But by then, years had passed. Years in which women who might have been warned kept lip-pointing, kept painting, kept swallowing radium, on the strength of a report that told the state everything was fine. That is the detail to hold on to. This was not a tragedy of ignorance alone. By a certain point, the men in charge had been told in writing by an expert they hired themselves, and they buried it. The truth was pulled out of the ground, quite literally, by two people who would not let it stay buried. The first was a doctor named Harrison Martland, the medical examiner of Essex County, New Jersey. Martland became convinced that these women were being killed by the radium inside them, and he set out to prove it with the rigor of a scientist. He devised tests to detect the radioactivity in their bodies. He had the women breathe into instruments that could measure radon gas on their breath, a sign of radium decaying inside them. And in one haunting, elegant demonstration, he took the bones of a dead dial painter and laid them on photographic plates in a sealed, dark drawer. Days later, the plates were developed. The bones had photographed themselves. They were glowing with a radiation strong enough to burn their own image into the film from within. To settle the question of Mollie Maggia, the woman whose death had been blamed on syphilis, her body was exhumed in the autumn of 1927, 5 years after her burial. Her remains were tested. Nearly every bone they examined was still radioactive. The radium was still there, still firing, still glowing in the dark of the coffin, years after it had killed her. The syphilis story collapsed. The paint had done it. The record could now be corrected. Mollie Maggia had been poisoned at work, and the second person the truth caught up with was the inventor himself. Dr. Sabin von Sokoki, the chemist who had created the glowing paint, the man who had reportedly once warned a girl to stop lip-pointing her brush, was himself dying of the very poison he had invented. He had handled radium for years. In November 1928, he died of radium poisoning, his blood destroyed by the element that had made his fortune and his name. The maker and his product went into the ground together. By 1927, some of the dying women had had enough. If the company would not protect them, would not even tell them the truth, then they would go to court. At the center of them was a young woman named Grace Fryer. She had started at the plant in 1917, days after America entered the war, an 18-year-old doing patriotic work. Now her spine was collapsing and her jaw was rotting, and she had decided to fight. It took her 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take the case. The science was new, the company was rich, and the law of the time made it brutally hard for a worker to sue an employer over a slow-developing disease. Finally, a young attorney named Raymond Barry agreed to represent her. 4 other women joined her: Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman, and Catherine Schaub. The newspapers called them the Radium Girls. In 1927, they filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation. The company's strategy was, in part, to wait. It secured delays and adjournments, and the grim arithmetic behind that tactic was obvious to everyone. These women were dying. Every month of delay was a month closer to a courtroom with no plaintiffs left in it. When the women appeared in court in early 1928, the sight of them made the strategy plain to the whole country. 2 were bedridden. Not one of them could raise her arm high enough to take the oath. They had to be sworn in where they sat, arms held low, bones too fragile and too painful to lift. The image tore through the national press. Here were 5 young women visibly dying, poisoned by their work, being run out the clock by a wealthy corporation that had denied any wrongdoing. The public was outraged. Marie Curie herself from France remarked that she was shocked such dangerous material was being handled so carelessly. In the autumn of 1928, days before the case would have gone to a jury, the United States Radium Corporation settled. Each of the 5 women received a lump sum, $10,000, a substantial sum then, plus an annual pension for as long as she lived, and the payment of all her medical expenses, to be reviewed by a panel of doctors. The company admitted no wrongdoing. It never did. The money could not give them their bones back. Several of the 5 would be dead within a few years. But they had done something no group of workers had really managed before. They had forced one of the most powerful corporations in their industry to pay for what it had done to their bodies in the full glare of a watching public. And they had put a template in the record for every poisoned worker who would come after. You would think that would have ended it. It did not. Because there was a second act to this tragedy, 1,000 miles west, and it is in some ways the darker one, because by the time it played out, no one could claim not to know. In Ottawa, Illinois, another company, the Radium Dial Company, ran another studio full of young women painting another line of glowing dials. They used the same lip-pointing technique, and the men running that plant knew what had happened in New Jersey. They had every reason to know that radium was killing dial painters. Yet in Ottawa, the lip-pointing continued. The women went unwarned, and when they began to sicken, the company did what its eastern cousin had done. It denied, it delayed, and it protected itself. Among the Ottawa women was Catherine Donohue. She had begun feeling ill in the mid-1920s. She developed a limp. She was in constant pain. In 1931, the company fired her. She later said it was because her limping was causing much talk on the factory floor, bad for the image of a plant that insisted its work was harmless. Her condition worsened horribly. She lost half her body weight. Pieces of her jaw came away. She could barely eat and became nearly bedridden. A young wife and mother of 2, disintegrating in her own home. Catherine Donohue and a group of the other Ottawa women sued. Their trial began in February 1938. It is one of the most wrenching scenes in the history of American labor. Donohue was by then so weak she could not travel to the courthouse, so part of the proceedings were moved to her home, where she gave testimony from her sickbed. At one point during the case, she learned from a doctor that her condition was fatal, and she collapsed. She testified anyway. She held up a small box in which she kept pieces of her own jawbone that had fallen out, and offered them as evidence. She won. In 1938, an Illinois commission ruled in her favor, finding that the company had knowingly exposed its workers to radium. The company appealed and appealed again, the same strategy of delay. Catherine Donohue died in July 1938, the day after the company filed yet another appeal. She was 35 years old. The appeals ground on until, in 1939, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the company's final challenge, and the ruling stood. Catherine Donohue did not live to see it, but she had won. And she had done it against a company that could not even pretend it hadn't been warned. It is a terrible way to earn a legacy, but the legacy is real, and it is enormous, and it is worth stating plainly, because these women paid for it in bone. Before the Radium Girls, the law gave workers almost no power against an employer who poisoned them slowly. Occupational diseases, illnesses that took years to appear, often fell outside the reach of the law entirely, because by the time a worker could prove what had happened, the deadline to sue had long passed. The statute of limitations ran from the moment of exposure, not the moment of illness. It was a legal trap that let companies outlast the people they injured. The radium cases helped blow that open. Courts came to accept a radical, humane idea that when a poison remains lodged in the body and goes on injuring you day after day, the injury is ongoing. The clock keeps resetting with every moment of fresh harm. That principle, that a slow poison is a continuing injury, became a foundation stone of occupational disease law. The cases established, more broadly, that a worker had the right to sue an employer for damage done on the job and to win. In 1949, Congress passed legislation extending compensation to workers suffering from occupational diseases. The safety standards that grew up around radioactive materials in the following decades, dosimeters, exposure limits, the entire discipline of health physics, trace part of their lineage directly to these women. When the United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was created in 1970 to guarantee Americans the right to a safe workplace, it stood on ground the Radium Girls had helped clear. There was even a strange scientific afterlife to their suffering. Because so many dial painters had radium permanently locked in their bones, they became, for later researchers, an irreplaceable long-term study of what radiation does to the human body over decades. A Center for Human Radiobiology was established to examine surviving dial painters and study their cases, gathering data that shaped radiation safety limits for workers in the nuclear age. The women who were poisoned because no one measured their exposure became the very reason we now measure everyone's. There is one last fact about the Radium Girls, and it is the one that stays with you. They are still glowing. The radium that killed them has a half-life of some 1,600 years. It did not die with them. It is still in their bones, in their graves, firing off its tiny bullets into the dark, exactly as it did when it was killing them 100 years ago. Researchers who have brought instruments to the cemeteries where dial painters are buried have measured it. The faint, patient radioactivity still rising from the ground. These women will go on quietly glowing beneath the grass for longer than the United States has existed, longer than most of the countries on Earth have existed, long after every person who ever knew their names is forgotten. That was supposed to be the horror of the story. But turn it over, and it becomes something else. They wanted to shine. When they were young and healthy, and the world had told them radium was a miracle, they painted it on their nails and their teeth and their faces because they wanted to glow, to be lit from within, to be something more than ordinary girls at ordinary tables. The men who employed them turned that wish into a weapon and lied about it until the women were dead. But the light outlasted the lie. Grace Fryer, Catherine Donohue, Mollie Maggia, they are still shining. And every worker who comes home safe tonight from a job that would once have killed them slowly owes a small, unpayable debt to a handful of dying women who could not lift their arms to swear an oath and who won anyway. They are the shining women. They always will be. Thank you for sitting with me in the quiet dark.